finish with this parable. Let's put the first slide up, please, Kajol. If you've been coming to our church the past number of weeks, you'll know that we've been working through a series of talks thinking about a living church. And we've been saying that, unfortunately, it's not always people's experience of church that it's full of life. But that was completely God's intention. We're not to be an institution per se. We'll need some form of structure to exist. But the starting point is the life and light of Jesus at work in us. The relationships that we have with one another, with God, and with our community. And when you ask people in the street, you know, what are the first words that come to mind when you think of church? I doubt you'll hear people say life. But that's what people should be saying, because that was what God's intention was. And in our nation at this point in time, it's absolutely crucial that we have churches that are alive for Christ Jesus in this generation. We need to be able to invite people to spaces and to relationships that are full of life, full of hope, full of joy, full of peace. People are looking for these things. We want them to know that they can find it in the church. We recently, as a church, put together this little leaflet on the back of going through an exercise of thinking about the journey we've been up till now, where we are at, and where we want to be going. The back page is talking about our next steps as a church. And this little document formed the basis for this series as well. And I just thought, before we get into the parable of the talents a little bit more, I thought we'd just take a moment to just recap what we've been going through in the series as a whole, and then think a little bit, what is our dream for New River Baptist Church? So recapping on what we've thought about in this series, we've thought about being a church that moves according to God's unforced rhythms of grace. We want to be an active church, yes, but we also want to be a space and a community where people can find rest and peace. We've thought about being a past, present, and future hope. That was when we celebrated our 20th anniversary service since part of the church was planted in 10 years ago, so 2004, and the other half of the church was preparing to refurbish this building. We thought about being a church that worships in spirit and in truth. You know, sometimes people say, are you a church of the word or are you a church of the spirit? And we're wanting to say, why does it have to be an either or? Why can't we be both? I want my cake and I want to be able to eat it. We've thought about being a church family, relational, intergenerational, multicultural. We've thought about how the small and the big works together. Big vision, small focus. That was kind of when we launched the focus groups, but thinking more generally as a church, how we're called to pay attention to the little things, but not lose sight of the big vision that God wants us to have. We thought about being a church for followers of Jesus. Discipleship is absolutely central. It's one of the roots of what we do as a church. We thought about thanking God for our resources and with our resources. But that's a big part of church life. We thought about how God is on the move and that there are new opportunities. And we've done a couple more in the series more recently. I just wonder, I want to give you a moment just to think, actually, what is your dream for New River Baptist Church? What is your hope? What is it you see when you're praying and you're thinking about this church that you'd love us to step into? If you're not part of our church, you can think about the church you're part of. What is it? What is the dream that you hold in your heart? What is it you would like us to step into? I'm just going to share just a few thoughts that I jotted down when I did the same exercise myself. I personally think of it in terms of seeing the need, but also the multitude of opportunities that exist. And I genuinely believe that we can make a difference. I'm not as young as I was once. And I see that life on earth passes quickly, and I want to make every moment, every year count. I feel for the children and the teenagers in London who are growing up without the knowledge of God, without that awareness of His love and His purpose for their lives. And I mourn for that. And I pray for open doors into schools and colleges and homes. And I pray for God to help us to disciple the young. I'd love to see a whole variety of community groups and connections happening here at the bridge. There's already a number but we've got scope to host more. Doesn't mean we have to start them. But what could partnerships look like where people see that there's all sorts of opportunities for them here at the bridge? Blessing our community with great coffee on offer, and with further opportunities publicized for people to make friends and explore faith in Jesus. I think that's a golden opportunity that we have here. I'd love for the life of Jesus in New River to pioneer new opportunities for church and mission in various other spaces in London and further afield. I'd be very happy if the passion we have for God and for His Word overflows into poetry, song, art, theology, film, social media. There's just so much that can be done, can be expressed in that. I want to hear and see people who feel lonely and without a family around them in their world, finding a family here at New River Baptist Church, and for this connection to operate across generations. I'd like some of our church members to become successful entrepreneurs who seek to create opportunities for employment and look to glorify God with their company profits. I'd love to see that happen. I look forward to seeing Christians at New River Baptist learning to employ their gifts for the kingdom of heaven, flourishing in ministry, and in turn helping others to step out of their comfort zone. I see times of worship where the Holy Spirit moves among us in precious, tangible ways, transforming lives and guiding us along creative pathways. I hope that the guarded, the angry, and the hurting, which is all of us, right? See that they can open up, become vulnerable, meet Jesus at the cross, and find hope, healing, and forgiveness. I see shared meals where ethnicities and ages mix and laugh and share together. I'd love us to help local people to be able to get onto the property ladder. I see many church members signing up to pray and fast for God to move, and I sense the excitement of seeing multiple answers to prayer. I see the life and love of Jesus being taken out into the workplace, the neighborhood, the school or college, the shops, the doctors, the gym, the pub. I feel there is much to do and much to learn. Mistakes to be made, obstacles to be overcome, relationships to deepen, hope to be shared, grace to be released and received. God has big plans for His church, and we're invited into it. I wonder what hopes you hold for this church, and I encourage you to write them down. And I'd love it if you'd send them to me at some point this week, because I'd love to read them and pray into them as well. Okay, we're thinking today about God's big plans for us and our invitation. God's big plans more generally. His big plan and our invitation. And I think this is a kind of good introduction way into thinking about the parable of the talents. Because all of this begs the question, what are we going to step into? Are we going to take that invitation to come and get involved, to contribute as well as to receive? Or are we going to be those who are observing what happens and not really getting involved? I showed a slide a moment ago called the Kingdom Vision. I think it sums up a little bit where we're going here. I've said before, we know a little bit, living in the United Kingdom, how our country thinks about things, how it views certain things. As Christians, we know we come into a place within the kingdom of heaven. That's our identity. That's our residence whilst we're still here on the earth. And we're learning to put on glasses where we can see things in the way that Jesus sees things. And where our everyday life is saying, Lord, I want to see more of your kingdom of light come into the darkness. And the church has a key role to play in that. A guy called Howard Snyder wrote a book called The Community of the King. I think it's a lovely title for his book. And he says this, he says, the church is the agent of the kingdom. It's possibly not the only one, but it is the primary one. It's the primary agent of the kingdom. It is the suffering form of the kingdom. It is the eschatological community living now under God's rule. In other words, we're pointing to what's going to be a future reality all around the world. Snyder insists that the church is a charismatic community, not a formal institution. Rather, its institutional structures are a bit like those of a family. The gifts of the Spirit are completely central to the life of the church, he says. And he insists that when 2 or 3 gather in Jesus' name, that adequately defines the church. Snyder believes that the church holds the key role in God's cosmic plan and that the church is an indispensable part of the gospel. He also sees clearly that evangelism cannot really operate effectively without the sustaining community, the church. He understands that the Word of God is not a dead letter, but dynamic, creative, and ever new. So let's think a little bit about this parable of the talents. If you've looked it up earlier, I'd encourage you to have it open in front of you, because we're just going to meditate on it for a moment as we're asking God, what is the next step for me? How can I get involved in this vision that God has for us as a church family here at New River? Many of us have heard the parable of the talents before. And I wonder if I was to ask you what you would say is the key message of the parable of the talents. What is its main message? And I would not be at all surprised if you said it's about the gifts that God's given us and how we steward those gifts and resources for His glory. And of course, I wouldn't disagree with that as a summary of the parable, but there's more going on than we have in just that description, the description we're familiar with from the many times, if we've been Christians for any length of time, that we'll have come across it. So let's dig a little bit deeper into these verses and into the parable as a whole. There are actually 2 versions of the parable of the talents. I don't know if you're aware of that. One of them is in Matthew 26. We're not going to look at that now. That's your homework, is to go away and read the parable of the talents in Matthew 26. You might find it interesting to compare it with what we're looking at today in Luke chapter 19. But just by way of a summary, Matthew 26, the topic is the kingdom. You've got various parables happening in this part of Matthew's gospel that are talking about the kingdom and about the need to be ready. You've got the parable of the virgins who have to light their lamp and be ready for the bridegroom to come. And it's into that context that the parable of the talents slots in. It's thinking about the value, the potential of the kingdom of heaven and of our responsibility to partner with Jesus and to be ready for his return, his second coming. You've got the master going away and coming back, and there's that understanding there. That's a bit like Jesus. Jesus goes, he ascends into heaven, but he's going to come back. So we better get busy. The other version, the version that we're looking at today, has a slightly different take on the subject matter. The topic I want to suggest is faithfulness. Will we be willing to openly identify with Jesus now, to conduct business on his behalf in a very public way before he comes back? And further to that, I would suggest, are we willing to keep doing that by the grace of God, knowing that it's unlikely that he's going to come back tomorrow? There's maybe still quite a way off of Jesus coming back. We don't know. But would we be willing to do this year on year on year? So let's actually look at the verses together. And we'll then draw a few conclusions together. So look with me, Luke 19. Yeah, just checking. Verse 11. The parable actually in Luke's gospel follows on from a drama. I don't know if you noticed that in the first part of Luke 19. And it's the drama concerning Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the one who climbs up a tree. And do you remember what Jesus does? He goes and finds him out, and he says, I'd love to come to your house for dinner tonight. And then Zacchaeus, just on the back of that invitation, completely turns around and says, I want to give away everything that I've unjustly gained in my role as a tax collector, and I'll give him back double. And it's like, here, the kingdom of heaven is come in this unlikely candidate, this tax collector. He's someone who's received the invitation and has grasped hold of it with both hands and is now running with it. But there's also another implication in that story. Are the religious types, the Pharisees, those who are really observant Jews, are they going to grasp hold of Jesus' invitation with the same abandonment, the same enthusiasm that this tax collector has done? And it's into that backdrop that Jesus' parable of the talents arrives in Luke chapter 19. And we notice that that's intentional by the way that Luke starts verse 11. He says, while they were listening to this. Jesus tells the parable because people thought that the kingdom was going to come straight away. Probably whilst Jesus was with them at that point in time, probably starting in Jerusalem in the coming weeks or months or years of Jesus' ministry. And Jesus already at this point is saying, no, you're getting this the wrong way round. It's not going to come straight away. So what do we find happening? Well, in verse 12, we're told that a man of noble birth, appointed, went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. Does that sound familiar? Well, I mentioned already that we see echoes of what happens in the life of Jesus, don't we? As we read it now with hindsight. Jesus is the true King of Kings. He conducts his ministry, dies, rises from the dead, ascends to heaven, but with the promise that he too is going to come back in the future. But there's a second echo that was a social, historical echo for people listening to Jesus' parable that we're possibly completely unaware of. And that concerns Herod the Great and his son Archelaus, who were both kings of Judea. Now, at the time of the Roman Empire, if you wanted to be the king of Judea, there's one person and one person only you have to ask permission to be king, and that was Caesar. So actually in 40 BC, King Herod the Great goes to Rome, presents his his pitch to Caesar to be the king, and is granted that title, that role, by Rome. Moreover, in 4 BC, very close historically to the time of Jesus, to Jesus telling this background, around 40 years before, I can remember things that happened 40 years ago, but this would have been the current in their society at the time, things that were talked about. Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great, goes to Rome to be king after his father. And get this, because I think it ties in with Jesus' parable. A Jewish embassy follows him to actually lobby Caesar to reject Archelaus' request. So not everyone is in favour of Archelaus being king. Not everyone wants to identify with him as king. Some are actively opposing him becoming king. However, Archelaus is successful in his bid, but his powers are severely limited because of this other lobby that's lobbying Caesar against him. Now, we don't know how Archelaus responded to all of that, but we do know that Josephus refers to his old feuds, so he's probably referring to this type of falling out, and that Archelaus was a particularly brutal king, which by the standards of that time was probably not great. Possibly, then, Jesus is using this backdrop to show that some Jews were rejecting his messiahship, his claim to be the King of Kings, his claim to be the Son of God, to rule, much like the Jews had rejected Archelaus' claims to be the earthly king of Judea. Well, I'm just going to throw that out there and you can have a think about that. Let's get on to verse 13. Verse 13, you'll remember the story from Sunday school or the last time you read it. 10 servants get given 10 minas each, or minas, or however we're supposed to pronounce that. A mina was basically 3 months' wages for a farm labourer. So if you're getting 10 of those, that's 30 months. So I reckon, what's that, like £50,000, something like that, in today's kind of currency. It's a significant amount of money. If you want to start a business, having £50,000 of capital to start is not insignificant, is it? You can do things with that. And we're kind of wondering, okay, what does that represent? Well, one of the commentators, actually an Egyptian Orthodox commentator, says that maybe it's good for us to consider the gifts, these bags of gold, in terms of the virtues that Jesus gives us, gifts of faith, hope, and love. And are we going to actually just try and preserve those, or are we going to share those with others? I'll just throw that out there. I thought that was lovely. Verse 15, king returns, and he checks to see whether his servants have undertaken business on his behalf whilst he's away. As I said already, his claim to be king has not been approved yet. So you take a little bit of a risk if you're coming out and saying, yeah, I'm doing business on behalf of the guy who I'm hoping is going to be king. What if he doesn't get appointed king? You're then in a bit of a tricky position. Verse 16, the first servant has doubled his money and is rewarded in verse 17. But I want you to note the way that the servant describes that, because I think it's beautiful. He doesn't say, if you look carefully, that I managed to double your money, my Lord. He says the gifts produce 10 more. And I think if we are thinking about kind of linking the master with Jesus, that's a good attitude, isn't it? Jesus gives us these gifts. It's his work in us by his Spirit that's going to do anything with these gifts, with these talents. Are we going to partner with God? Are we going to lean into that? Or are we going to obstruct it? Or sit on the fence? And it reminds me that little bit in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6 and 8, where Paul says, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Each receives wages according to their labour. but he knew that it's God. Even in Paul was working so hard, wasn't he? But he knew that it was only God working through him that really counted for anything. And then we get that beautiful line, because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities. And when I read that, it really spoke to me. Okay, maybe I might not feel like I'm qualified to be the mayor of London or to govern a city. I feel like that's quite a daunting task. But maybe, just maybe, I can be trustworthy to Jesus in a very small matter. And that's my prayer this morning. And I think that's a really good response for us this morning. Lord, what is the very small matter that you ask me to be trustworthy in this week? Help me to be faithful. Help me to be courageous, to not step back from that opportunity and that challenge. Then verses 18 and 19, second servant comes up. He's made 50% profit, which I'm guessing in a couple of years, tops. That's pretty good going, isn't it? I'd quite like that for my pension scheme. I would be happy with that. He is rewarded with 5 cities. I'd also handle that as well, although I don't really like the idea of running 5 cities. But then verses 20 to 23, we have the other servant, whom we're told is operating out of fear and has sought to preserve what he's been entrusted with, and he's even failed to put any of the money into a deposit account so that he can give the money back with interest to the nobleman. And not only that, but he offers a critique, uninvited, possibly exhibiting his socialist leanings, to the new king's approach. He says the new king is harsh. He makes a profit out of the work of others. And possibly he's looking back to a preferred past rather than looking forward to the opportunity that lies in front of him. Verse 24 to 26, the nobleman leaves the servant with his distorted view of the king. I think that's what God does sometimes. Many people have a distorted view of Jesus, a distorted view of God. And he's trying really hard to change that. But sometimes he just has to accept that, because he's given us all free will, hasn't he? We're not robots. God is very honouring of our choices. So he leaves the servant with his distorted view of the king, doesn't try and change his mind, but his mina is given away to the servant with 10 minas, to the shock of all those standing by. And it comes with that phrase, to everyone who has, more will be given. Those with nothing, even what they have, will be taken away. And I think we sense here that a response of faithfulness to Jesus results in greater gifts. Unfaithfulness loses us the life God gave us in the first place. The way I heard it described one time was God is looking, and this was someone talking in relation to money, God's looking for people who can be faithful, trustworthy with little. And he can entrust them with more than that, can't he? If you're faithful to God with £50, I think he sees, okay, you're not just going to spend it on yourself, you're going to do the right thing with that. He can entrust more. And then we get this really troubling last verse, particularly because we're seeing lots of similarities between the master and Jesus, where basically the instruction is given to kill all those enemies who opposed the nobleman's rule. Now I'm just going to throw out just a few thoughts on that, because it's in the Bible, we have to engage with it. What are we supposed to do with this violent ending? Well, some commentators believe that the parable fuses together 2 different stories. The people who are writing the gospel Luke and anyone who was collaborating with him, or stories, whoever he'd learnt that story from. There's a kind of coming together of two different stories. We also know that prophets, and Jesus was a prophet, as well as being the Son of God, they use strong language intentionally to shock, to arrest, and to force consideration. We also know that parables often end with a kind of question or a lingering thing for someone to think about and kind of mull over. And Ken Bailey, who writes about Luke's Gospel and this parable coming from a Middle Eastern perspective, because he spent a long time out in the Middle East, says actually in the Middle East, in our culture, if Rich is working for me and he comes into the office on Monday and I say to Rich, pack away all your stuff, you're sacked, you're fired, that's it, you're done. We're like, okay, that's done and that's a finality. And we start packing away our stuff and leave. In the Middle East, that's not how it works. I say exactly the same words to Rich, and Rich goes away, and what Rich thinks is, oh, this is terrible, I've really offended Robin, and I haven't been doing my work up to standard. I need to try and find some wise counsel to see how I can go back to him and persuade him to keep me on. It's the start of a negotiation process. We don't actually know if the king follows through on this, if he does kill those servants in the story. And that's kind of lingering there. Also, Jesus is relating the story not only to notions of his kingdom and of his kingship, but he's also making references to common understandings of kings and kingship as exhibited by recent kings of Judea. So there we go. I haven't got a nice, neat answer why we've got this explosive verse at the end of the story. But there are certain ways of understanding it without thinking that this is what God is like, because we know God isn't like this. Okay, let's just summarize and then think about how we're going to respond. So I think that this parable speaks to us today in the context of God having a big plan and putting out an invitation to us to get involved. It speaks, doesn't it, about perspective, about how we view Jesus. How you view Jesus will directly influence what you choose to do for him, your attitude towards church and Christianity. If you think that Jesus is harsh, that God is harsh, and he asks human beings, that's like the Greek idea of the gods, that they were capricious. They didn't care about human beings. We were just tools in their hand. Then I would suggest it's going to be really hard for you to get thoroughly involved in a church and in mission and in worship and in community, the kind of things we talk about here at New River. So let's let God reshape how we view Jesus. Let's study the Bible. Let's ask him to work in our hearts so that some of the vulnerabilities and hurts from the past get healed by him and we can see him as he truly is. Secondly, I believe that this parable talks about accountability. This is an important business that we're doing right here, right now, today, and in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. Church, Christianity, the kingdom of heaven, coming here on earth as it is in heaven, is absolutely vital business. It's not a game. It's not another hobby, like joining the gym or a golf group or signing a subscription to Sky Cinema or whatever it might be. It's more than that. I think we're encouraged to have that attitude. It speaks to me about faithfulness. Will we be trustworthy in a little? And I don't know about you, I'm reading this, I'm listening to this, I'm preparing for this, I'm saying, Lord, help me to be trustworthy in a little. It speaks to me about endeavor. Being willing to stand up for Jesus, even when it's unpopular in the environment that we're in. Tenacity. Keeping on going, year on year. Working for him. Those things that we can think of where we've labored, we've put our heart and soul into it, and we haven't seen the results we'd hoped for. Will we let Jesus minister to us so that we keep going? it speaks to me about courage. I don't find it easy to identify as a Christian, to tell people that I love Jesus when I know that they're anti or really skeptical. And probably you can relate to that too. It talks to me about investment. What is the best investment we can make with our lives, with our energy, with our gifts? Isn't it into things that are eternal? Where lives and communities can be transformed. So what might that mean for us? What might be a response for us today? Well, that's really a conversation for you to have with God in the first instance, before you have a conversation with anyone else. But I'm going to throw out just a couple of thoughts, what it might mean. It might mean that you want to consider getting baptized as an open sign that you belong to Jesus and that you're making a decision to follow him for the rest of your life. This might be the talk where you're like, do you know what? I need to pin my colours to the mast. I'm going for Jesus. And if that's you, come and speak with me. We'd love to have some more baptisms. But I think that's the right approach to baptism as well. Small groups. We've read in recent weeks, Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47, the early church gathered in a big group in the temple courts, but it also gathered in small groups in people's homes. Having a small group of people, making an intentional connection with a small group of people, maybe 6 to 12, maybe a bit less than that, maybe a bit more than that, can really help us to live out our faith. Not only that, we can help a small group of other people to really live out their faith. Maybe that's the next step for you. You've not yet been part of a small group, or you've been part of one but you're not so committed anymore. Get back into it. It can really be helpful. Maybe for you, you just would love to see what the opportunity is to serve, for your gifts and talents to be employed to serve others here in our church. And we'd love to have a conversation with you about that, if that's you and you're just wondering what that might look like. Maybe the next step for you is partnership. We've got a partners meeting this afternoon. You're very warmly invited to come and join us for it. The partners make a shared commitment together, a covenant together, to partner together for the gospel. That involves us in worship, us and others moving towards God. Involves us in community, us and others relating deeply to one another. It involves us in mission, sharing what we've received from Jesus with others. It involves our resources, both our gifts, our time, and our money. But we do it happily, don't we? We do it knowing that it's going to make a difference, that it's our investment in the things of God. You might be here today and you're thinking, actually, I want to give something. I want to give financially. The giving of our church is the primary way in which we fund our aim of making disciples of Jesus who bless their world. And if you're not yet giving, that might be your response today, is to say, I want to step out in faith, start giving towards the work of New River Baptist. Again, don't be shy. Have a chat with myself or with George, who sat over there, is giving people a wave, and we can try and make it as easy for you to do that as possible. Maybe your response today is that I want to be someone who prays regularly for New River Baptist Church, believing that God answers prayer and that prayer makes a difference. Maybe the response for you today starts with a prayer. If you haven't yet prayed that prayer of saying, Jesus, I want to make you the Lord of my life. I'm sorry for the way that I've gone after my own way in the life that I've lived up to this point. I want to turn around from that. I want to follow you. Maybe that is your response today. But maybe you're someone who you feel God's Spirit nudging you to pray more for the church. Again, have a conversation with someone who's part of the church. Let's try and think how we can facilitate that. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. We're going to sing a song together. And as we sing this song, why don't you continue that conversation with the Lord? Maybe you want to just tell him as you sing this song, Lord, I love you and I want to commit myself to you. I want to recommit myself to you. Maybe you feel like there's a confusion about what you feel God is asking you to do, how much time and things you've got available. You can bring that confusion to God as we sing this song and invite him to come and bring clarity. After we've sung the song, we're going to do a prayer response together. But let's sing this song first, and I invite you, if you're able, to stand up to sing.